everybody. My name is Danny.
And my name is Michael.
And you're watching The Human Rights Show.
We have a great show for you today.
We will be speaking about American healthcare this afternoon, and our show will focus on several key points.
First, the United States' failure to provide universal affordable healthcare is in direct violation of several international conventions. Not only the right to healthcare, but as well as the obligation of the state to provide it.
Second, the Trump administration's attempts to dismantle the healthcare system are not new, as the U.S. has been intentionally watering down the right to healthcare for years.
Finally, we want to explore the impact that this has on the American people.
So sit back in your uncomfortable chairs with little desks on them, grab a snack if you were smart enough to bring one to class, and enjoy. You're watching The Human Rights Show. Healthcare. Probably something you don't need to think too much about. Here in Canada, you don't need to worry about your medical costs.
Yep, we have the unique privilege of being able to go out, drink so much that we poison ourselves, and then stumble into the nearest ER, get your stomach pumped, and do the whole thing over again.
You know, Michael, perhaps we shouldn't use the word unique since almost every highly developed country in the world has universal healthcare.
Well, that's not true. There are lots of first successful countries out there without universal healthcare, like America.
Well, no. It turns out America is breaking the law by not providing its citizens with universal healthcare.
When we think of human rights, the first thing that pops in our mind is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It sets out a set of fundamental human rights that are to be universally protected, such as the freedom from discrimination, freedom from torture, and freedom from slavery.
So that's that, right? Problem solved?
No.
See, in the United States, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights provide broad human rights protections to its citizens. Many of the rights contained in the Constitution are equivalent to rights found in the UDHR, especially those related to political and civil liberties.
And although the U.S. Constitution provides strong protections for civil and political rights, it fails to recognize the economic, social, and cultural rights guaranteed in the UDHR, including the right to healthcare.
So sadly, even though the U.S. was largely responsible for the UDHR being drafted in the first place, and even though they have signed it, the United States of America does not recognize the right to healthcare. So legally, it may look like the United States is off the hook, right? Wrong again. Although the United States has not recognized this right to healthcare in the UDHR, they have recognized it in other legislation.
Now, we won't delve too deeply into the many documents that the U.S. has signed but not ratified, such as
the Convention on the Rights of the Child. States parties recognize the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and to facilities for the treatment of illness and rehabilitation of health. States parties shall strive to ensure that no child is deprived of his or her right of access to such healthcare services. Or the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The steps to be taken by the states parties to achieve the full realization of this right shall include the creation of conditions which would assure to all medical service and medical attention in the event of sickness. Well, yeah, because then we could also mention how the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties obligates signatories to refrain from acts that would defeat the purpose of the signed treaty, and therefore we could come to the conclusion that the U.S. is violating these laws.
But while doing research for this show, we found way too many international commitments being broken by the United States, covering under 10 minutes. So, we will just be focusing on two documents which have been ratified and are legally binding. First is the Constitution of the World Health Organization. It states that the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being. It also clearly states that the governments have a responsibility for the health of their peoples, which can be fulfilled only by the provision of adequate health and social measures.
You see, the United States has a history of signing these documents but not ratifying them. But here's an example of a ratified piece of legislation that is being completely ignored. It explicitly states that governments have a responsibility for the health of their people.
Next is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It states that state parties undertake to prohibit and eliminate racial discrimination in all its forms and to guarantee the right of everyone, without distinction as to race, color, national or ethnic origin, to equality before the law, notably in the enjoyment of the following rights: the right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services.
This convention was intended to stop discrimination so everybody could enjoy their rights. And in this legislation, there is a right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services. Now, I'm no international human rights lawyer, but I think that this is the U.S. formally recognizing the right to healthcare. Since the U.S. states that they will not discriminate against people based on race to guarantee their right to healthcare, it is assumed that they are accepting the fact that there is a right to healthcare. So clearly, the US is breaking international law. But how did we get to this point? For that, we need to briefly examine the history of American healthcare, and to do this, we go to our chief history correspondent, Michelangelo.
Thanks, Danny. We will start in the 1940s when the World Health Organization Constitution was signed. This was a clear declaration of the right to healthcare. In the late 40s, Harry Truman attempted to pass a universal healthcare measure which would have insured all Americans, but it failed to pass due to the American people's fear of government interference because of communism. Next, it would be renewed by the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s, where he would fail miserably to pass a healthcare insurance bill, once again because of communism? Later, in 1965, when Lyndon B. Johnson had taken office, he renewed the effort but only to insure seniors and the disabled. He successfully passed the Social Security Act, which would later become known as Medicare and Medicaid. After him, Richard Nixon was offered a plan to expand Johnson's Social Security Act to all Americans. However, Nixon rejected that plan and instead passed the Health Maintenance Organization Act of 1973, which made employers in the private sector offer insurance to their employees because of communism. This, of course, relinquished all government responsibility over the healthcare system. Then, Jimmy Carter took a shot at it, but didn't accomplish anything because Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan in the 80s further increased the role of private insurers through COBRA, which was an omnibus bill. It allowed employers to keep former employees on their health plan but charge them the full premium. Because of states' rights? Oh, and communism. Then, in the 90s, Bill Clinton passed the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, which placed some restrictions on pre-existing conditions. Although it largely allowed private insurers to continue price gouging their customers, he did, however, manage to pass the Children's Health Insurance Program in 1996. This subsidized the cost for low-income families with children.
Thanks, Michelangelo. Recently, the American healthcare system was overhauled with the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, which increased Medicaid funding and made it easier for people to get insurance. In just 2 years, the uninsured share of the population has roughly halved, with estimates ranging from 20 to 24 million additional people covered during 2016. The ACA imposed serious restrictions on the private healthcare system. It made it illegal to discriminate against pre-existing conditions, put caps on premiums, and eliminated lifetime maximums.
However, even with this system, around 30 million people were left without any healthcare insurance at all, and it largely remained a private sector industry. This betrayed the government's commitment to be directly responsible in providing their population with healthcare.
Now, we cannot talk about healthcare in the United States without referencing the current president, Donald Trump.
Repeal and replace was a popular campaign slogan for Donald Trump. The Republicans have not succeeded in repealing or replacing Obamacare, but not for a lack of trying.
First was the disaster of a bill, the American Health Care Act. To fund tax cuts for the upper class, the bill would have cut Medicaid funding drastically. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected that the American Health Care Act would have resulted in the increase of 23 million uninsured people over 10 years. Next, the administration tried to push the Better Care Reconciliation Act through. The bill would have cut public insurance, limited state spending on Medicaid, and increased premiums to low-income Americans while slashing their benefits. Finally was the party's latest attempt, the Graham-Cassidy bill. The bill was similar to the previous two, cutting funding for Medicare while lowering taxes for the wealthy.
Now, before we wrap up, we have to look at some of the implications that this is having on citizens. Americans cannot survive if they do not have health insurance, since bills are simply too high.
Yeah, let's continue by going into the cost of medical expenses in the US. This is what a 6-hour emergency room visit will cost you in the United States if you do not have health insurance. This man broke his ankle and had to pay $80,000 to have it fixed. Finally is the highlighted charge on this bill, which is a $40 skin-to-skin contact after a C-section. They had to pay $40 to hold their baby. Well, that is all we have for you today.
I hope you enjoyed our show and learned something about the healthcare system in America.